Welcome to OVWA's Webinar Wednesday. We thank you for registering for today's webinar, the Ohio Advocate Network. We will be recording today's webinar and it will be archived at www.ovwa.org. All of your mics are muted and we're unable to utilize the raise your hand option because of that. But we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the chat box or the Q&A option. And as Terry is able, she will take those questions and we can also get those at the end. We will make every effort to answer all of the questions that you might have. You have an option of utilizing the live transcript. To enable or disable that in your meeting controls, please click live transcript and then select show subtitle or disable if desired. A couple of housekeeping points about receiving training hours and certificates. If you are looking to receive CEUs for the social worker counseling boards, you must attend the entire training and complete the survey at the end. Everybody will receive a certificate via email within 1 week from today if you've attended at least 80% of the webinar. And if you're attending by phone or someone else's registration link or have more than one attendee viewing the webinar from the same computer, please email me at wendy@ovwa.org so that I can assign the appropriate training hours to the appropriate registrants. If you are attending by phone, I'll need the phone number that you used to join the webinar. Upon conclusion of today's webinar, you will receive a link for a brief survey. I encourage you to take the time to complete the survey. We both use the survey results to comply with our grant funder, but also we definitely take your feedback into consideration to improve our webinar series. So thank you in advance. Today, we welcome Teri LaJeunesse. Teri, upon graduating from Miami University with a BA in psychology and sociology, she began her career as a victim advocate in 1982 with the Greene County Prosecutor's Office Victim Witness Division. She has held nearly every advocacy position during her 39-year tenure with the office, serving as division director for the last 16 years. Active in a variety of local, regional, and statewide initiatives, Teri is a longtime member of the Ohio Victim Witness Association, a past president of the OVWA Executive Committee, and currently sits as a member of our board of directors. Teri is a registered advocate with senior standing, a credential she has held since 1994, and remains a proud member of the Ohio Advocate Network's inaugural class of registered advocates. Using her knowledge and expertise to guide other individuals seeking the registration credential, Teri has served on the OAN Review Committee for 21 years, providing administrative support and chairing the committee for the past 12. Since 2004, she has also been a credentialed advocate at the advanced level with multiple specialized designations with the National Advocate Credentialing Program. And if any of you joined our OVWA Webinar Wednesday last month, you heard Jeanette mention her several times as helping to found the Ohio Advocate Network. So Teri, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
You're welcome, and I'm very happy to be with everybody today. Makes me feel good to use my many years of experience to benefit the other advocates across our state. So before we start talking about the credentialing process itself, I wanted to start with just a little bit of history of the Ohio Advocate Network. The network was established in 1994 by a multidisciplinary coalition of victim advocacy providers in Ohio. Reflecting on decades of advocacy work across the several different disciplines that had come together, the group sought to transition the perception of victim advocacy from strictly a grassroots movement into an acknowledged, accepted, and publicly affirmed profession. In those early years, it was common for individuals who were working in victim advocacy positions to come from many diverse backgrounds. They had varying levels of education and training, as well as unique professional and/or lived experiences. This was all very, very helpful, especially in establishing programs and to provide services for crime victims. The diversity was beneficial in many ways, but the field was expanding even then and has continued to do so. The group recognized that an acquired body of knowledge and an essential skill set were going to be necessary to adequately prepare folks to meet the challenges inherent in competently supporting, assisting, and advocating for victims of crime in the many different arenas. Developing and expanding core direct services was just a beginning. The founding members of the coalition knew that it was also crucial to promote the delivery of these services within an ethical framework, which was based upon professional standards. This unwavering emphasis on an ethical foundation remains an essential component of the OAN Credentialing Initiative today. And finally, the group expressed confidence that the profession would continue to grow and evolve, which it certainly has, and knew the ability to continually keep pace, offering quality services, was dependent upon a well-trained workforce. This emphasis on the need for specialized training was not limited to just new advocates who were entering the field, but instead focused on the entire arc of a victim advocacy career. Ongoing training expands knowledge, enhances insight and perspective, and promotes a best practice approach, which is essential for all individuals who are engaged in advocacy services. So the way that the entire credentialing process was set up, as I mentioned, was designed to cover the entire arc of an advocacy career. An individual who is applying to be a registered advocate can apply at one of three different levels: registered advocate with advanced standing, and registered advocate with senior standing. Generally, what separates these three different levels is the amount of time an individual has been working within the field providing direct services to crime victims. The more time that you accumulate providing services provide you an opportunity to upgrade to a higher standing. But regardless of which level you are approved at, the appropriate credential to use would be simply RA. It's not really proper to use RAAS or RASS. It's just RA for registered advocate. All individuals, regardless of standing, are considered a registered advocate. You can use this credential after your name on correspondence, on your business cards, in agency publications, or in a variety of different ways. When an individual applies for their registered advocate credential, they're going to choose their specific discipline. And this may be more than one, and it's going to be based upon the victim population that the advocate predominantly serves. So in some organizations, you may be like if you work for a domestic violence project, that may be the population of individuals that you are serving, someone who's been the victim of a domestic or some sort of intimate partner violence. Some organizations may serve both victims of both domestic violence as well as sexual violence. So you may be selecting those two disciplines. The general multi-crime category would be for individuals who would work, for example, like myself, in a prosecutor-based setting where you're serving individuals of all different types of crime, or if you're working for an organization where you're serving several different or crime victims in several different disciplines. So at the outset, you're going to select your discipline. This is something that can be modified over time. You may start in one organization and move to another. This is nothing that is specific, but the different disciplines were set up to encompass victim advocates working in both a system-based capacity as well as a community-based capacity. So just some general information about the OAN registration criteria. Applications are accepted only twice per year during the months of June and December. And specifically, the open application cycle is June 1 through 30. We have one coming up here just in a couple of weeks. It's going to open up, as well as the month of December, December 1 through 31. It's very important to remember that the applications can only be submitted during these time periods. OAN does not hold applications over from one period to the next, and applications that are received. So for example, an application that might have been received in March would be declined and would be returned to the recipient to be submitted during the appropriate time period. So very important to understand there's only two open application cycles. As a new applicant, there are two different essential qualifying components for the registered advocate credential. Work experience, that is providing direct services to crime victims, and pre-registration training. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about these components. So direct service provision, to qualify for the credential, I know it, and you'll hear this several times throughout the presentation, an applicant must provide direct services to crime victims. Victim advocates through the course of their work, whether an advocate or an allied professional or administrative support individual, many people may provide direct services to victims of crime in some capacity during the course of their work. For some individuals, that may be 100% of what they do. For other individuals, it might only be a portion of their overall employment duty. So it's very important that you're kind of parsing out the time that's spent providing direct services to victims. To qualify at the entry level, the registered advocate level, an applicant would need a minimum of 1,950 hours. This is the equivalent to 1 year of full-time employment. Moving forward and continuing on in the advocacy profession, if an individual at such point in time that they've acquired a minimum of 77,800 hours, that would qualify them to apply for a registered advocate with advanced standing. This is the equivalent of 4 years of full-time employment. And then with 6 years of full-time employment equivalent, an individual who has accumulated at least 11,700 hours would be able to apply for registered advocate with senior standing. So as I mentioned, an individual can work in a variety of different capacities. The employment can be either in a paid or a volunteer capacity, or it can be both. Some individuals work part-time for an organization. They may volunteer at another organization, or they may work part-time and volunteer at their own, at one single organization. So the time can be accumulated. The important part of the employment is that it must be documented. Whether it is paid or volunteer, it needs to be specifically documented. And the victim advocate, the Ohio Advocate Network advocate registration credential is available certainly for victim advocates, as well as volunteer advocates, administrative support staff, and allied professionals. Allied professional would be, for example, a law enforcement officer, a mental health professional, perhaps an individual working for a CASA program. But again, individuals will only be granted credit for the portion of their time spent providing direct services to crime victims. Documentation of direct service hours is verified through a memorandum of confirmation. This is actually a specific component of the application itself. And the MOC is a document which is not completed by the applicant themselves. It must be completed, signed and dated by an authorized agency representative. And this is very important. This is not something that the applicant themselves would completely fill out and then just submit to someone in their organization to sign off on. It's something that must be actually prepared by the authorized agency representative themselves. That could be a supervisor. It could be somebody that works in personnel or human resources. It could be the elected prosecutor if it's in a prosecutor-based program. So there's a number of different individuals that would fit the bill as an authorized agency representative, but essentially it's somebody that has the authority to have access to agency records and the ability to look historically back and be able to verify the work hours of an individual person. A separate memorandum of confirmation is required for each agency. Somebody may have worked before they apply. They may have worked at, for example, 3 different agencies. You're going to have a separate memorandum of confirmation for each agency that you've been employed at. It would not be acceptable, for example, for somebody at the current agency you're working at to verify hours that you might have worked at or volunteered for at a different agency. It would have to be a person from that organization itself. And then on the actual memorandum of confirmation itself, there is space on that document there are 3 separate entries. So if an individual has worked at a particular agency, but they've held some significantly different positions, and for example, you may have started out as a volunteer and then were hired as a part-time as a crisis line worker, and then 2 years later were hired in a full-time capacity as a case manager. So on the memorandum of confirmation, each of those separate positions, the information for the documentation of the hours, those should be entered separately because those are significantly different positions. And the employment documentation, this verification needs to come from official agency records, which are kept in the course of the organization's regular business. This is particularly important if you are associated with, for example, a small nonprofit organization. We've had a number of individuals in the last several years apply for the credential, and it had to be declined, not because we in any way did not believe that the individual had been doing good work for a number of years. Certainly there's no reason not to believe that was true, but there were no identifiable agency records that were kept that were documenting the hours of direct services. So if you are working in a small organization such as that, it would be a good idea, if you're not already documenting that, it would be a good idea that you would need to start, because that's going to be required in order to achieve the registered advocate credential. It would be similar for an individual who might be working solely in a volunteer capacity. Some organizations do a really, really good job of maintaining records of the volunteer time, but not always. So it would be definitely would behoove the individual to track their time. And that doesn't mean just the hours that a person is volunteering, it's the amount of time they're actually providing direct services. And I can use my organization as an example. We use volunteers to assist us with our after hours crisis response responsibilities. And so an individual may sign up for a 10 or a 15-hour overnight shift. If they don't get called out, that does not constitute 15 hours of time for the OAN credential. If they do get called out and they spend 3 hours providing assistance to a crime victim, then those 3 hours can be attributed. So it's very important to make sure that the documentation is in place. So I'm just going to talk about some very basic information about the training requirement. We just covered a few basics about the direct service provision. Now just a few we'll talk about this much more in detail as we go through. The information that is contained for the Ohio Advocate Network regarding training, either pre-registration training or continuing education training, you'll find in a document that's called the Training Area Guideline or the tag list. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth. It looks like this. This is one side. This is the other side. So we're going to go back here. So the tag list is divided up into a Series A side that would be for new applicants, and a Series B side that would be the continuing education training topics for renewing applicants. The Series A side, the topics are divided into core training topics and specialized core training topics. And on the Series B side, likewise, they're separated out into core topics as well as specialized topics. Training, and again, I'll talk about this more in detail in just a sec. Training may be completed in a variety of formats over the period of time, which could include seminars, conference workshops. You might have an in-service training at your own organization, as well as an onboarding or an orientation training. There may be a volunteer training. There are a number of pre-approved comprehensive training courses, as well as live or recorded webinars. And then there are also various organizations that have online training modules. So under normal conditions, and we're going to talk about normal conditions for a minute. I realize in our world, nothing is normal right now, but under normal conditions, anybody applying for the credential must have, especially as a new applicant or as a renewing applicant, you must have at least 24 hours of training. As a new applicant, at least 24 hours of pre-registration training, and as a renewing applicant, at least 24 hours of continuing education training. At least 18 of those hours must be completed at in-person training events. During the past year, during the COVID pandemic, the Ohio Advocate Network Review Committee has waived this in-person criteria for renewing applicants. So someone who is renewing or who is renewing and upgrading, the in-person requirement has been waived. That will continue again for the June 2021 cycle. However, the requirement was not waived for new applicants. If you are a new applicant, you still must show at least 18 hours of in-person training in one of the required, one or a combination of required topics from the tag list. And the training must be documented. So documentation can be in the form of a certificate of completion. It could be the agenda for an onboarding or a volunteer training. So there might be a variety of ways that the training can be documented. New applicants are required to submit the documentation with their application. Renewing applicants are not required to submit it, but they must retain it, because if their application is audited, they will have to provide the documentation to the review committee. So again, here's the tag list. You'll see across the top the core topic categories. Those are the 9 categories that all new applicants must complete some amount of training. By some amount, that means at least 1 hour, and all of those topics. And then you'll see we talked about you will select your discipline. In the 4 boxes below, you'll see the 4 different disciplines and the specialized core topic that must be completed in each discipline. So this is important to note also. If you are selecting 2 disciplines, so for example, if in your organization you serve victims of both sexual violence and domestic violence, and you're selecting both of those disciplines on your application, you will have to provide documentation that you've completed the 5 specialized, training in those 5 specialized core topic categories in both of those disciplines. So that's something that's important to note. If you're only selecting 1, then that's fine. You only have to provide documentation of those 5. But if your organization provides services to both disciplines, then you really need to be providing documentation of completing and providing documentation of training in both of those areas. And then the Series B side, the continuing education training, can see this is obviously a much wider, very diverse grouping of very general topics. In each of these general topics, there are many, many, many subcategories of training that would kind of fall into this. So there really is just a wide variety of ongoing training that can be completed and will be accepted. If you are a renewing applicant and you have some question as to whether or not a training that you've taken would qualify, all you need to do is reach out either by phone or email, and you can certainly inquire, this is the training I took, is this something that I can use to renew my credential? And we certainly can let you know. But this is a wide variety, and these we try. It would be impossible to obviously come up with a succinct list that would cover everything, but we do try to make it as general as possible, with the understanding that many kind of subtopics are inherent in this list. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the pre-registration training. As I mentioned, new applicants must complete a minimum of 24 hours of training, with at least 18 of those hours being in person. You have to have at least 1 hour of training in each of the 9 core topic categories, and at least 1 hour of training in each of the 5 specialized categories. What I'd like to focus on with this is that the training has to have been completed in the 4-year period immediately preceding the application submission. And that means an individual who might be applying as a new applicant, applying for the OAN registration credential in June of 2021, all of their training that they're going to be using has to have been completed between July 1st of 2017 and June 30th of 2021. So you have a 4-year period, a 4-year look back from which to pull all to make sure that you've covered the basis on all of the pre-registration training, not only the required number of hours, but also all of the 14 of the required training topics. For a new applicant, it's also important to remember that the documentation must be submitted. Again, a certificate of completion or some other form of verification that you have completed the topic. The Ohio Advocate Network has approved 4 separate comprehensive training programs. The Ohio Attorney General's Office Basics Academy, the ODVN, Ohio Domestic Violence Network, their Domestic Violence Advocacy Fundamentals course, the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violences Training Institute for Sexual Violence Advocates, and then finally Summit County's, their Victim Assistance Academy. So those 4 comprehensive programs have been pre-approved by the Ohio Advocate Network. They cover all of the required training topics. They provide at least 24 hours of training. And when they are presented in person, they also meet the qualification for at least 18 hours of in-person training. So something that's important to remember for all of those individuals who have completed one of those comprehensive courses during the last 12 to 15 months or so, if they've completed it virtually, that still covers that, you've still met the requirement for your 14 required categories. You've also met the requirement for the total overall amount of time of 24 hours of training. What you still have to provide documentation, though, would be 18 additional hours of training in any of the approved tag list topics at any point in time during the last 4 years. So there's still multiple ways to make it, even though those virtual courses have not been provided in person during the last year. There still definitely is a path for an individual to submit a new application having taken one of those courses virtually. Now let's switch gears a little bit to renewing applicants. An individual who is renewing or submitting an application to renew and upgrade has to complete continuing education training. Each 2-year cycle, the OAN registration credential has to be renewed every 2 years. And during each 2-year period, the applicant has to complete at least 24 hours of continuing education training. These can come from any of the B series side, either the core topics or the specialized topics. It can also come from any of the A series topics as well. It's not uncommon at all for information to be updated. And so taking watching a webinar or taking some other training, for example, on recent updates to the Crime Victim Compensation Program, that is certainly something that is valuable information, even for somebody who may have been working in the field for 10 or 15 years. So the A series topics certainly do apply. But keep in mind, even though it indicates 18 hours must be in person for renewing and upgrading applicants, the waiver will still apply to the June 2021 applicants. While there is a general emphasis that can be placed on an individual completing training within their specified discipline, it's also very important for all applicants to get cross-training in a variety of different topics, both general and specialized. So certainly that's something that is definitely encouraged. And as I mentioned, although the continuing education training must be documented, that documentation does not need to be submitted with the renewal application, but the applicant should retain it in case they would be audited and have to provide the information. So I'm going to take a pause here really quickly. I tend to talk really fast under normal circumstances, and I'm trying to get all this information in, but I'm going to pause really quickly here just to see, Wendy, if any questions may have come in on anything that we've discussed so far.
We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, I'm going to move forward then with once an OAN credential has been approved and the person is a registered advocate. As I mentioned, it has to be renewed every 2 years. A renewal notice may be emailed. As a matter of fact, those renewal notices are going to go out this week, but it is a responsibility of the registered advocate to ensure that their registration is renewed on time every 2 years. When renewing, an individual may, if they have enough qualifying hours, they also can choose to upgrade to either advanced standing or senior standing. But upgrading is not something that's required. We have some individuals that became a registered advocate 20 years ago, and that's, they've just kept renewing every 2 years. They've not upgraded. That's not a bad thing. It's their personal choice, and that is perfectly fine. There's no requirement to upgrade if you are renewing. That's simply up to the individual. So there are 3 different kinds of Ohio Advocate Network registration applications: the new application, the renewal application, and the application to renew and upgrade. So I'm going to first talk about the new application. And what you'll see on your screen is it kind of mirrors the sections in the application itself. And I'll talk a little bit about both of them. In the application itself, section 1 is information about the applicant. You make sure you fill in all of the different areas that are required. Section 2 would be the agency information, where you're documenting where you have worked and the hours that you've worked at each organization, and just the information about the agency themselves, documenting your professional experience. Section 3 would be that signed and dated memorandum of confirmation that we had previously discussed. And again, keep in mind that you need to have a separate memorandum of confirmation for each organization where you've worked. Also, the pre-registration training documentation. There's a section specifically for it is section 4, which is that section. There's an area where you can indicate if you have by chance completed one of the pre-approved comprehensive courses. If not, below that, there's an area on the application where you would indicate for each of the required training topics, specifically what training you took that met that requirement and whether or not that training was completed in person or virtually. So all that information would be provided. And then again, you would have to also submit with the application a copy of, make sure it's a copy. We do not want the original training documentation that you've received, for example, your original certificate of completion. We just would want a copy, but you have to submit a copy of all training documentation as well. There are 2 new components this year in the new application: a direct services observation, as well as a letter of recommendation. It's important to know that the same person cannot sign off on both of those documents. The individual who completes and the direct services observation has to be different from the person who submits the letter of recommendation in your behalf. This does not necessarily need to be a person that is a supervisor of yours at your organization. When you read the application and the instructions, it will tell you there's a variety of different individuals that can fulfill this role. But just make sure that you know it has to be a different person that does the direct services observation from the letter of recommendation. The application also contains a signed copy of the Nova Code of Professional Ethics. As many of you might be aware, the National Advocate Credential Program, which is allied with the National Organization for Victim Assistance, just recently, maybe about a month ago, sent out a revised copy of their Code of Professional Ethics. That's the code that the Ohio Advocate Network has adopted. You will see in the application, it still contains the older version, and that's fine. We will not insert the newer version until after the June renewal cycle. So the newer version will be embedded in the application for the December 2021 application cycle, but as of right now, it's still the older version, and that's perfectly fine. There's not a problem with that. There will also be a section where you will read and initial several certifications, and then the application has to be signed and dated, and the application fee must be submitted along with all of the other documents. The Ohio Advocate Network does not accept personal checks. OAN has never accepted personal checks, but it seems every cycle somebody submits a personal check. So I would certainly remind everybody, to please understand, we cannot accept personal checks. The application will be declined. It must submit either a money order, an agency check, or either a certified or a cashier's check from a bank. So in the renewal application itself, again, very much like the new application, there's information the first two sections where the applicant would put their own information about themselves, either to confirm nothing has changed or to give us an update on they may have had a change of name or just difference of a phone number or an address. So just to confirm the information about themselves and their agency. There's also a section where they can document their continuing education training, the date of the training, the title of the training, whether the training was completed in person or electronically, and then also the number of hours of the training. The renewing applicant also has to submit a signed copy of the Code of Ethics. They must initial all the certifications, sign and date the application, and submit the required fee. Again, money order, agency check, or certified check. So the application to renew and upgrade is kind of a hybrid of the first two. It pulls together because you are documenting an expanded number of hours, it pulls together components of both of the applications, but there are some very similarities also. Again, you would submit information about yourself, either to confirm or to provide updated information about yourself and your agency, and then also your professional experience. So the memorandum of confirmation is also a component of the upgrade application, but it should reflect the cumulative hours that you've worked for any single agency. So let's say somebody applied 5 years ago and they submitted in their application, they submitted a memorandum of confirmation, and they had, X number of hours at that point in time. And then now fast forward 5 years, they've continued to work for that same agency. So on the memorandum of confirmation they're submitting in their application to renew and upgrade, it should show the cumulative number of hours from beginning to the present date of employment, not just the number of hours since the last application. It should be the cumulative number of hours that they have had. And then if there has been no change so in an initial application, there may have been more than one employer that you worked for. So you don't have to resubmit another memorandum of confirmation for an older employee if that information has not changed. No need to resubmit something. Just for your current employer, it has to reflect the total number of hours. And then likewise with the renewal application, you have to submit documentation of continuing education training, a signed copy of the Code of Ethics, as well as all of the required initial certifications. And then again, the application itself must be signed and dated and the requisite application fee submitted. So what happens if somebody is a registered advocate and for a variety of different reasons, they're either unable or they fail to renew their registration at their designated 2-year interval on a regular basis? If that happens, the credential will expire. If the registration credential is expired by more than 4 years, it will go into a lapsed status and the applicant must reactivate before they can renew. So we kind of have a built-in grace period of sorts. If an individual applies and then 2 years later, let's say they apply in June, and 2 years later they're supposed to renew in June, and for whatever reason they're unable to do so at that time, they certainly can still apply at the next open cycle, that next December or the following June. They're still welcome to submit a renewal at that time. That you don't have to start the process all over. You were just submitting, but if it's been more than 4 years since your approval, and that sometimes does happen. Somebody might have been an advocate for many years, left the field, and now it's 10 years later and they've come back and they would like to reinitiate their registered advocate, the credential. They certainly can apply to reactivate and renew. It's a simple process. There is a reactivation fee that will be assessed, but again, you don't have to start all over. Just kind of pick up where you left off, but you do have to understand the timing. So if you are in a lapsed status, if you reapply within the grace period, there is no reactivation fee. It only kicks in if it's been more than 4 years. And for individuals who are reactivating, they still have to complete the required amount of continuing education training, and that has to be completed. The 24 hours has to be completed within the 4-year period, again, immediately preceding submission of the application. So just a little bit more general information about the application process itself. Applications for the Ohio Advocate Network Registered Advocate Credential must be submitted by U.S. Postal Service. We do not accept electronically submitted applications, and we do not have the ability to accept credit card or e-payments. So just a requirement of the money order, cashier's check, or a bank check. So you will find the complete instructions, any additional information, and all of the application packets themselves on the Ohio Advocate Network website. They host this for us, and we are immensely appreciative. When you visit the website, www.ovwa.org, you're going to, in the top right-hand corner, you're going to click on the Ohio Advocate Network page. And then each of the application packets is divided between the new application, the renewal, or the renewal upgrade. You're going to want to download the entire package, thoroughly review everything, and make sure that you have all of the information you need. On the website, you'll also find a copy of the Code of Ethics, as well as separately the tag list. And then there's also a CEU training verification form. And this can be really, really handy, both for new applicants as well as individuals who are applying to renew their registered advocate credential. It can be especially helpful, for example, if somebody has completed either a recorded webinar or some sort of a virtual training that they did not receive a certificate for. The CEU training verification form is a handy way to document and organize your training, so you don't have to go back later and think, okay, well, I know I did this or I did that, or I just don't remember when. You can organize the training. It is important to have a supervisor sign off on the CEU form. If it's a virtual training for which you did not receive other documentation. So essentially, you're having a supervisor verify that, yes, you completed the webinar or the online module or whatever it was. So that can suffice for your documentation. And if at any point in time during the process, the registration process, as you are either a new applicant going through putting together your application, or if you're renewing or considering upgrading, if you have any questions or would like some technical assistance with the application, you have my contact information. It's available here as part of this webinar, but it's also available on the OVWA website on the Ohio Advocate Network page. Anything, you can certainly get a hold of me by phone or email, and I'd be happy to help in any way that I can. So before we move forward, I'm going to take another little pause. I know it's a lot of information to take in one time, but I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions.
Hey, Terry, we have a couple questions. The first question is, I am the only victim advocate in my county as it relates to adult felony and juvenile prosecution. If I provide direct services to victims on and off all day, every day, would my timesheets be sufficient for documentation of the number of hours providing direct services to victims?
It would, but you would not submit those timesheets to us. So the documentation would come. So a supervisor, somebody, well, an authorized representative of the agency that you work for, that individual, whoever that authorized person is, would certainly be able to review your timesheets to determine that you're working in a full-time capacity. And then that person also has the ability to have insight into the fact that in your daily work, you are providing direct services all day long. So it would be sufficient, but it would not be a situation where you would be submitting those timesheets to OAN. That would be something that the authorized representative could review to be able to sign off on the memorandum of confirmation.
Okay, she says, thank you, Terry.
Oh, you're welcome.
Another question, this person had asked or indicated that their application is not due until July 2022. And the question is, will the online trainings be accepted when that time comes up to renew as well? Like, will they still be accepted for renewal?
Yes, so the issue of the virtual training is something that the Ohio Advocate Network Review Committee has continued to monitor and discuss from the beginning. And certainly we realize that moving forward. So let's just say by September or October of this year, things are starting to open up, and then maybe by the beginning of next year, that there is a much greater offering of in-person training. We're certainly going to realize that obviously this whole year there was not. So whatever decisions are made, we only make decisions based upon each 6-month review cycle. So when the committee meets in July of this year, they will make the decision as to what will happen in December of this year. We already decided in January that we were going to be waiving for renewing and upgrading applicants. We were going to be waiving the application requirement of in-person training both in June and December. So I can already tell you in December, it will also be waived for renewing applicants. They have steadfastly maintained that there is no waiver for new applicants. But unfortunately, I can't give you any guarantees of what things are going to look like for next year, except for to tell you clearly we understand if there's an inability to attend in-person training for renewing applicants, we certainly will take that into consideration, and it is an ongoing discussion, but again, we will make at the end of this year, we will determine how we're going to move forward next year, and it's basically going to have to be based upon whether or not and in what capacity in-person training returns.
I think that is all that we have for now.
Okay, so over the course of doing this for many years, there have been some kind of glitches that come up from time to time, things that people stumble over a little bit, and because they happen with some frequency, I kind of like to
Hi, Terry. I think maybe we lost you or we've lost your audio for just a second. So if everyone could bear with me for just a second till we find out what happened to Terry.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure where you lost me at. So with this slide, I'll just repeat myself. I apologize for anybody if I'm being repetitive. In doing the work and being a part of the review committee for so many years, there have been a number of glitches that we've kind of encountered in the applications. And so it's helpful to kind of point out the stumbling blocks that people have sometimes so that people can kind of be on the lookout for them. When you're completing the application, it's really, really important that you make sure that you are completing the proper application, depending upon what you are trying to accomplish. If you're a new applicant, if you are simply renewing, or if you are wanting to renew and upgrade, make sure that you are downloading and completing and submitting the proper application for what you're intending to do. If you submit an incorrect application, it's going to be declined, and there may not be time to get the proper one in. So just make sure that you're using the correct application form. And again, I know I've said it a number of times, make sure you're submitting the correct form of payment. On your applications, please, 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 please print legibly. Quite often I have to try to decipher a phone number or an email to call somebody and ask them what is their name or what's the name of their organization, because I can't read their writing. So please make sure you're printing, and please make sure you're printing very legibly. And then that's very important, because in our ability to communicate you obviously is dependent upon our ability to read what's on the application. And we don't want to get your name misspelled on a certificate or anything else. So just make sure we can read what you write. Again, applications are accepted only during the months of June and December, and they must be received by the deadline, the last day of each month. The memorandum of confirmation, I know I've said this several times, but it is something that a hiccup that we see a lot. The number of hours on the memorandum of confirmation must match the hours that are provided in section 2 of the application. So in section 2, when you put your agency information, you are also indicating I've worked for this agency in this capacity, and for this many hours. So on the memorandum of confirmation, if you indicate in section 2 that you've worked for that organization for 5,000 hours, and the memorandum of confirmation says you've worked there for 3,500 hours, well, clearly that's a problem. So you need to make sure that, I mean, those figures need to match. The memorandum of confirmation is essentially verifying what you are putting in section 2 of your application. And again, there has to be a separate MOC for each employer and a separate entry for each significant position you've had within the agency. Just a little bit more about training. Providing training is not the same as receiving training. We've had individuals that will call and say, you know, they provide training on a regular basis, and can that count? And no. So if you train people to do things, you cannot count that as your pre-registration training or your continuing education training. For that training, it's something that you actually attend yourself as a recipient, as an attendee, not something that you are providing. Again, keep in mind, again, under normal circumstances, a limited amount of virtual training will only be approved during each application cycle. Let's talk a little bit about training certificates. I know I mentioned that it's very important that for new applicants have to submit the documentation, but I see a wide variety of information contained in training certificates, and not all certificates are created equal. So, and I can use 2 Days in May as an example. It's a great certificate. It has a lot of information in it. It lets me know, you know, when the training was completed, who sponsored it, the number of CEUs that were awarded. However, it does not tell me what you were trained on. So if you are a new applicant, that certificate in and of itself is not going to be sufficient to document the training you have completed. for that particular training, you also have to submit the registration confirmation form that you receive when you fill out the workshops you're going to attend. So your workshop confirmation sheet, that has to accompany that certificate. So if you have a similar type of certificate does not give the complete information that we need, the date of the training, who sponsored it, how many training hours it was, and if it's not understandable from the certificate, either the title of the certificate or the title of the training, if it's not understandable clearly understandable what the topic was, you're going to have to provide something else to help indicate this training covered this specific topic or topics. We just need to know. Sometimes it's very clear, it's no big deal. We can tell right away, but other times certificates can be particularly vague. So that's important. And then again, in lieu of a certificate, the completed, signed, and dated, the CEU training verification form is acceptable. This is especially helpful, as I mentioned, for if you viewed recorded webinars or completed an online training module, or some other type of virtual training for which there was no certificate awarded, or even an in-person training for which there was no certificate awarded, then completing that training verification form and having a supervisor sign off on it, that's going to be the documentation you need to get credit for that training. When we talked about the tag list, I mentioned that for pre-registration training for new applicants, it's important to remember that you have to have the documentation that you submit has to cover a variety of things. It has to be enough documentation to show us that you have completed at least 24 hours of training, and that it has covered all 14 required training topics, those 9 core topics we talked about, and the 5 specialized core topics. And you'll see those laid out on the tag list, but the documentation you submit has to cover both of those pieces of information. So just make sure if you've completed one of the pre-approved training courses, if you completed it in person, you only have to send that one certificate. However, if you completed it virtually, you have to send that certificate as well as information showing completion of at least 18 additional hours at an in-person training. And then we talked about already that applicants who serve more than one distinct client population and have selected more than one discipline, your training still has to cover all of the specialized core topics for all of the disciplines. Training must be completed within the 4-year period. And I think, new applicants, yes, send me your documentation. Renewing applicants, it's not necessary. With continuing, we do it's not uncommon for individuals who are submitting a renewal application or an application to renew and upgrade to also send their certificates. It's simply not required, but you definitely should retain them because the OAN Review Committee does do audits. And if we've audited your application, you will have to submit them at that time. And finally, all Ohio Advocate Network applications must be submitted through the mail to the address that you see on your screen. This information is also contained in both the instructions as well as the application itself. And then also on the Ohio Advocate Network page of the OVWA website, you'll see this information. So very important to make sure you're submitting your application to the proper place. And I think we've covered the waiver information, but just one last time that the waiver of in-person training is in place again for the June 2021 application cycle for renewing and upgrading applicants, but it does not apply to new applicants. So we've come to the end of the prepared portion of the presentation. And at this point in time, if there are any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I do have one or two questions here. Are you ready?
Yep.
The first one is, I've recently taken a new position. I'm not currently the victim advocate. However, I'd like to maintain my OAN credential. Is this possible even if I'm no longer working in the field?
Absolutely it is. So we've had individuals sometimes who they may retire from their advocacy position, yet moving forward, they still want to maintain their OAN credential. And we have had some individuals who leave an advocacy position, they're going to work someplace else, but they think there's a possibility they may come back at some point in time. And so likewise, they want to maintain their credential. It's entirely possible as long as they continue the required amount of continuing education training. Like anybody else, that's the criteria for renewal, is you just have to complete the 24 hours of training. As long as they continue, an individual is certainly welcome to maintain their credential for as long as they'd like.
Thank you, Terry. Another question that popped up. I've completed numerous trainings, but not one specifically called case management. Do I have to attend a training with that specific title?
No, and this kind of plays into when I was talking about the certificates of completion. Sometimes the certificate itself very clearly, illustrates what the training topic or topics were. But for those nine core topics, you're not necessarily going to have a specific training that is going to be labeled, case management 101. Something like that, and they exist out there, but you don't necessarily have to have a training that talks about that. What's important about it is any training that you receive is the content itself, not the title. So for something like case management, you're going to want to attend a training that's going to offer you information on the essential duties and or tasks which are necessary to like prioritize, organize, deliver, document, and evaluate advocacy services. Something like that would appropriately cover that particular type of topic. Other things, so for example, oftentimes people may ask about the topic of crime victims' rights. So if you've attended a training on Marcy's Law, or if you've attended a training on an update of crime victims' rights. It doesn't have to be something specifically titled that. It just would need to be a training that would pertain to the status of crime victims' rights, generally speaking, and certainly within the state of Ohio. So in Ohio, and you'll see on the tag list, we specifically mention not just constitutional rights, but we also mention the Ohio Revised Code Statute 2930. So the statutory rights are equally as important depending upon what your discipline is, because that certainly governs the types of services that you are required by law to provide to crime victims. So.
Excellent. Thank you. There was another question that came up. Before being hired as a victim advocate, I worked for 5 years as a children's services caseworker. Can that time count towards OAN registration credential?
Okay, this is something that we do run into often when I mention that an individual who is an allied professional is also welcome to apply for the OAN registration credential. So sometimes it may not be that they are currently working in a field that would be considered an allied professional. Sometimes they may have had previous employment, and children's services is a really good example. We also have individuals who previously worked as maybe a CASA worker. And so the amount of time that's going to qualify, it's really, I can't really say it's a yes or it's a no. It's really going to depend on the specific duties of the particular position that was held. So working within children's services as a caseworker, there are multiple different types of responsibilities that a caseworker may have. And depending upon what their assigned duties were, they may be, it may be that they were on a regular basis interacting quite often with children and or their caregivers who were experiencing a victimization. But simply being a children's services caseworker in and of itself does not mean that you're providing victim services. So we really would have to kind of look at what was your, how were you assigned? What type of work were you assigned within that organization? And then based upon that, what is the amount of time percentage-wise that we might, that might be approved to be used towards the registered advocate credential. Another example that has come up from time to time is individuals who are working in as a mental health as a mental health counselor, as a provider. So there are some mental health practitioners that's their entire practice. Their entire practice is they may be embedded in an organization that serves crime victims, and that may be the individuals that they serve. That's all they do. And then there are some individuals who have a general practice, and certainly they are providing, some of the individuals whom they are providing services to may have been the victim of a crime either recently or historically. And so again, we're kind of looking at, we would have to kind of dig a little deeper and find out what their practice is, and how much of their time arguably can be considered to be as providing a direct service to crime victims versus doing their general job duties. Hopefully that covers that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking here. I think there's a couple questions with regards to specific, trainings, either through orientation training at their agency or like the ODV and domestic violence advocacy fundamentals training. Mm-hmm. And do those meet the criteria?
Yeah, so the ODV and domestic violence advocacy fundamentals is one of the 4 pre-approved comprehensive training programs that the Ohio Advocate Network has designated as kind of checking off all the boxes for a new applicant. It meets the criteria for the number of hours, it meets the criteria for in-person hours when it's provided in person, and it meets the criteria for all of the training content. If it was completed virtually, it still meets the criteria for the number of overall hours and training content, but that individual would still need to show, if they are a new applicant, they would still need to show an additional 18 hours of training, which was completed in person. Now, if you are renewing, if you already have the registration advocate credential and you are simply renewing and you've completed domestic violence advocacy fundamentals, it all counts. It doesn't matter if it was virtual, at least for right now. It doesn't matter if it was virtual or not. It would all count. So for things like orientation or onboarding trainings, again, we would be looking at specifically what the individual was being trained on, who's doing the training, the amount of time that's spent on topics. So as far as that's concerned, the review committee is becoming much more stringent on approving certain trainings that would be considered to be comprehensive. And we would specifically be looking at the content of what somebody is providing, and then getting an understanding of, is a certain topic, just talked about, for 5 minutes and then you move on to something else, or was there a substantial amount of time spent adequately discussing a particular, the particular training topic, especially if it's one of the core topics. So with onboarding or orientation training, again, we would have to look at it specifically to get a sense of whether or not it is actually fulfilling the requirements as they are stated.
Okay, Terry, I think that wraps up our questions, unless anybody has additional questions they want to ask real quick. I think we're finished.
Okay, there is one thing that I only because this has come up, it's not really a question, but it's an issue that's kind of come up in the last, I'd say specifically, maybe like the last 2 years, that we've had a number of individuals who have called while they are completing their application because they're having difficulty getting documentation from a previous employer. It may be that, I might get a question, the supervisor at where I used to work, that person's no longer there. So who can I get to document my training? Because they know they now have to have the memorandum of confirmation. Or in even some instances, the agency itself is no longer there, or the nonprofit they work for is no longer there. So they're looking to figure out how can we get documentation. So this is something that's kind of like a case-by-case basis. We can try to work with them to see and give them some maybe some direction. So verification can come from somebody other than the person who directly supervised you. It could be even though that individual may not have worked there, if it has been an organization that's been established for some point of time, even, for example, a current administrator would still have access to and could verify historical records of the organization, even though that person did not directly work with you. They still would be able to go in and verify the record. So a current administrator, or if it's a nonprofit and you're looking for, okay, who can verify my time? That might be the president of your board. Again, assuming that those records are kept during the course of regular business. It could be the president of the board or a board member, a human services director, really anyone with access to the agency personnel records. If the agency is personally closed, that's something that I would suggest the individual call, and we can try to figure out see if we can identify other individuals who might be able to provide documentation. Although it's been a number of years ago, we had an individual who worked for an organization, but worked primarily within the court system on a regular basis. And the organization itself no longer existed, but the judge in the court where this individual worked for a number of years, the judge was very familiar with the work, and we were able to use the judge as the individual who was able to sign off on as acknowledging the period of time that she worked. So we can't always find a suitable resolution, but we can certainly try. Obviously it needs to be a fair process for everybody, but we certainly can try. And while it's unfortunate, it does happen from time to time that somebody might leave their employment under less than good conditions. Sometimes the relationship, the employment relationship might end poorly. If you have an individual from a previous agency who is refusing to complete the memorandum of confirmation, again, that's something that I would suggest. If you reach out and get in touch with us, we will try to help figure something out. And so there's a variety of things that we can do, but the memorandum of confirmation as a required component is very important, that it be completed, and that it be completed properly and by the right individual. And if there are issues with a previous employer, we can certainly try to help with that.
Oh, that's really good information to know. I know that even when I was when I was helping some of our staff get certified, that very issue came up with somebody that had moved from a different state. So
yeah, and I've had people that come from a different state, and so trying to and again, especially if it's somebody who might have been working in the field for some period of time and then left the field, for a bit of time, and now has moved someplace else. And so it can be kind of hard. And it is very unfortunate, but there are times when the answer just has to be, I'm just really sorry, but that time we can't, if we don't have documentation, that time doesn't qualify, only because there's no way of being able to verify it.
Right. Well, Teri, I can't thank you enough again this year for presenting on the Ohio Advocate Network. We don't have any other questions, so I think we can say goodbye for now, but thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, Teri, and please join us next month for OVWA Webinar Wednesday. We will be putting that information out here within the next week. So thanks again.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Stay safe and be well, everyone.